I'm going to tell a story this morning, but I think it does better when you help me tell it. So, who here saw their angel this week? Did anybody see their angel this week? All right, well, we're going to tell an angel story this week. So I need some volunteers. Who likes being missionaries? All right, I got some missionaries. You three boys right here. You can be my missionaries. Who likes to be soldiers? Ooh, I got some soldiers. You, and actually, I need all of you to be soldiers. Come on. Perfect. All righty. So, let's see. I need a king. You just became a missionary. You turned into a king. So you're going to come stand over here because you'll make a good king. So this mission story comes right out of this book right here. Who can tell me what this book is? It's a Bible. And it comes out of Acts chapter 12. All right. So this group over here are soldiers. You two missionaries are going to stand over here and preach to them, okay? Actually, I got too many missionaries. I only needed one. All right. You get to be over there with soldiers. All right. And he was telling about Jesus and how Jesus loved them and how he died for them. Well, this had just happened not that long ago. This particular preacher's name was Peter. Do you guys remember Peter from the Bible? Yeah, that's right. And Peter was preaching and telling them all about Jesus. And what happened over here? King Herod heard about that. And what did King Herod do? He's like, I just killed 2 preachers the other day for this very thing. But there was a certain festival going along, so he chose not to interrupt the festival with a public killing, because that's not very popular to kill people at a festival. So, King Herod ordered that Peter get arrested. Okay, soldiers, arrest Peter. Take him away. Over here, in this dark corner right there. All right. Now I need a soldier sitting on each side of him. And you got to hold the hand on each side. Okay, now more soldiers over here. Nope, just 2. Now I need 2 more right here. You're at that gate, and you 2 are over here at this gate. 2 more out here at this gate. You aren't to let anyone come past. And King Herod ordered that this trial will take place immediately following the festival in 3 days. And so the festival is coming to the end. And as it's coming to the end, King Herod suddenly turned into an angel. And a blinding light came in, and he walked right into the prison, right through all the guards. And they didn't even see him. And when he walked up to Peter, the chains fell off. The guards no longer held him. And he said, Peter, come with me. And Peter's like, how are we getting out? And he walks up to the first gate, and it just opens. And out they go. And he comes to the second gate, and out they go. And he walks off, and he moves over, and he's like, suddenly the angel's gone. And Peter is standing in the street with nobody around him. All right, well, he's standing in the street. I need you guys to immediately become a group of church members. So come over here. Kneel down right here, quickly. All right, you are praying that Peter is not killed tomorrow. All right? And so they're praying, and they're praying, and they're praying. Meanwhile, Peter comes up, and he starts banging on the door. And a servant girl hears it, and she goes and opens the door, peeks out and sees Peter and goes, ah! Slams the door in his face and runs back in the room. And they're still praying and praying. And she's like, Peter's outside. And they look at her and, what are you talking? We know he's outside. He's in the prison. And then she's like, no, he's at the door. And they're like, well, let him in. So she runs and lets him in. And she opens the door, and Peter comes in, and they were so excited, and they jumped up and down. And then what they do? They start praising God. They were so excited. Meanwhile, Herod calls for his prisoner. And what did they find? An empty prison. We won't say what happened to the guards because it didn't end well. All right, you guys come back over here. I got a little bit more for you. Sit down in your seats. Right here. So, have you guys ever been really, really scared? Really, really scared? Like you thought you were going to die scared? I was in a mission field once, and I was really, really scared because I went to do some construction in Nicaragua. And through a long chain of events, when I got there, the people that were supposed to pick me up weren't there because my flight was listed as canceled. And I did something every dumb American does. I jumped in the first taxi and tried to get to where I need to be. Well, the first thing an American doesn't do in a third world country is run off by themselves, especially if they don't speak the language. The second thing they don't do is forget the address of the place they're going. I thought I had the address, and I'd written it on my airline tickets because I wouldn't lose that. But when I went through the airport in Miami, or Orlando, they decided I didn't need that nasty old wore-out cover anymore, and they gave me a new one. And my address went with it, and I got a new one. So I didn't know where I was going. And just a couple weeks before we went there, one of the people that was going to be at our group that was helping with this mission had disappeared, and they hadn't found him. They still haven't found him. And he did what I did, and he wandered off by himself. He was known for traveling in country prior to an event, and he was traveling and disappeared and never showed up again. And so here I am in a taxi, going to a place I don't know where it is. I barely remembered the name, and my taxi driver didn't know either. And you know you've been in a taxi too long when they stop to get gas. It's a sure sign you've been in the taxi too long. I was in a taxi for over 2 hours. And I had some really good time to start praying because I was in Managua, and it's a big place. There's lots of streets, and everywhere you went, it was 6 lanes. And pretty soon I realized there wasn't 6 lanes anymore. There was 2. And there wasn't very many houses anymore. And it was looking a lot more poor. And I was like, I don't think this is going to end well. He's trying to figure out where to get rid of me. And I got scared. I've been praying some more, but I really prayed then. And the next thing I know, I come around a corner, and there was a big green highway sign with the place where I needed to go, right on it with an arrow. I was so shocked I couldn't even talk for a minute, and then I started hollering at my driver to turn. He wouldn't turn. It took me 3 miles to get him to stop and ask directions again. And, of course, we were close enough to the school. Everybody knew about that school because it was a big school. And they immediately turned him around. And I think my angel guided him to the right road so that I found where I needed to be. And God protected me, and I didn't end up like my friend that I knew that we've never found him. So I want you guys to remember, no matter what happens, this book tells all kinds of stories of angels coming to people's rescue. He'll come to your rescue too. And you remember to thank Jesus tonight for your angels. All right, you can go sit down.
Today's verse is found in Mark 5, verses 35 and 36. And while he was still speaking, some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house and said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher anymore?" As soon as Jesus heard that word was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not be afraid, only believe."
Thank you. And our elder, Dan Webster, will have our message today.
Life seems so good, so very good, so much to be thankful for. He had a good wife, a good job. He had a daughter that was a constant source of joy and love. She was his only child, and since God had not blessed them with any others, she was a special gift from God. God had certainly rewarded his piety and gave him Sarah. God had blessed his obedience and his generosity to the church. Yes, she was a gift from God. She had a special place in his heart that only fathers of daughters can understand. She would meet him at the gate when he would return from the synagogue each day. She had done that every day since she could walk, or so it seemed. As he walked down that dusty road to the edge of town, he would think less and less of the cares and problems at work, and more about that beautiful young woman that she was too quickly becoming. It was a joy to see her peering over the gate, watching for his return. When she saw him top the last rise, she would come running down the road. Perhaps now that she was getting older, he would need to talk to her about that. It might not be proper for a young lady. That's what his wife said anyway. She was probably right, and he should have that talk, but, not just yet. Even at 12, she would throw her arms around his neck to welcome him home. And at that moment, all was right with the world. It didn't matter what happened at work. All was right with the world, his world. And he could forget all the stress and the challenges of his job. He could forget about the controversy stirred up by this man named Jesus, who many were claiming was the Son of the Messiah, Son of God, the Messiah. He could hardly believe all the stories he was hearing about this man. They were rather far-fetched. And he cautioned all to be very wary of being led astray by these stories. They certainly couldn't be credible. When the Messiah came, he would have surely made himself known to the leaders of Israel. They would be the first to know that he had come. They would be the witnesses of his power, not just beggars and lepers and others with even worse reputations. These people were not credible witnesses. Just be patient, he would tell them, over and over again. And how tired he got from all this controversy, all this strife about the one treasured hope in every Jew's heart, that the Messiah would soon come. He could understand their hope, but he didn't want their hope to cause error. And he was afraid that their hope would soon be shattered once again, and perhaps they would eventually come to disbelieve that the Messiah was on his way. So it was such a relief to leave that all behind and meet his daughter at the gate. Here they would enjoy each other's company and relish the goodness of God. Yes, she was his gift from God. Things can change so fast. He remembered kissing her goodbye that morning as usual, but she was not at the gate to meet him when he got home that evening. This had occasionally happened now that she was older and would sometimes be busy helping her mother with household chores, and so not make their appointment at the gate. So though he was disappointed, he wasn't overly concerned until he saw his wife coming to meet him from the house. He noticed a look of concern on her face and immediately asked what was wrong. Shortly after their new meal, Sarah had felt ill and had been in bed since that time. His wife had called for their physician, and he had come, but he was puzzled by the illness. The physician had given her some medicine to give Sarah and some directions about how to care for her. Then he rushed from Sarah's room. She was quiet. He could see that she was in pain. She kept turning from side to side, as if she just couldn't get comfortable. He knelt at her side and placed his hand on her head, and she definitely had a fever. He spoke softly to her, and she tried to smile through her pain. His whole life was now focused on that now helpless little form on the bed. The controversy, the discussions, the opinions of the other leaders mattered little now. The only thing that mattered was that his daughter was very, very ill. He prayed to God to bring her relief, to bring her healing. Hour after hour, he continued to kneel at her bedside, pleading with God to bring healing to his daughter. He reminded God of how he had been so faithful in his tithing and had been so careful in his obedience to the law. He'd always been a good example for others. He should be blessed. So please, God, heal my daughter. Finally, he reached a point where he asked God to let this illness pass to him and spare their daughter. He was surprised by the morning sun shining through the windows. He anxiously looked at the bed and saw that his daughter was quiet and still. He thought she must be feeling better. But as he looked closely, he noticed her shallow breathing and how flushed her face was. He hurried to his wife to tell her to call the physician or even another physician. Call them all. He wanted all the help possible for Sarah. The doctors came, and one after the other they shook their heads and said there was nothing that could be done. The last doctor from across town came, and he too said there was nothing to do, that he could do. He said he would have come sooner, and maybe he could have done something if he could have been there earlier, but there was a great crowd down at Levi Matthews' house because Jesus was there. So he had taken another longer route. The physician's parting advice was that maybe he should ask Jesus to heal his daughter. It was said that he could do that. Well, that wasn't much hope, but at least it was something. Jairus went back into his daughter's room. How could he bear to part with her? He could not live without her. He had never felt so helpless. There was nothing he could do, and God did not seem to be listening to him anymore. So should he try this man, Jesus? He was down to the last things possible. Nothing else he could do. He had run out of options. But how could he go to some faith healer, some lunatic that had somehow tricked people into believing in him, that he was the Messiah, that he could heal people? How embarrassing it would be for him, a leader in Israel, to go to this man and ask a favor. There would certainly be witnesses. He looked again at his daughter. He hated to leave her now that any breath could be her last. He hated to think that he may not be there with her end so close. But he couldn't stand to think that he hadn't tried everything to help her. He would swallow his pride for his daughter's sake. He knew he was reaching for any hope at all to do this, but what was left for him to do? There's nothing left that he could do. He had run out of options. So having made up his mind, he rushed from his house, only briefly telling his wife where he was going and why. And she just sat there making no response. Her grief was so deep. His idea brought her no hope. As he neared Levi's house, he momentarily paused. He shouldn't be going into this man's house. This man was a sinner. This man was a traitor to his people. He would be tainted by entering into this house. And what if someone saw him? Well, of course someone would see him. It seemed the whole town was crowded around this one house. But the picture of the still form of his daughter came to his mind, and he started pushing his way through the crowd. When people recognized who it was, they gave way and let him pass with looks of amazement. He soon found himself before a man he knew instinctively was the man that he was looking for. This must be Jesus. He cast aside his pride and knelt before this man. At first, he couldn't find the words he wanted to say because his grief was so overwhelming. Finally, he looked up at Jesus, and with tears in his eyes and voice, he for the first time acknowledged his fears and said, "My daughter is dying. But if you could come and place your hand on her, she will live." Immediately, Jesus arose and started toward his house. And he walked beside Jesus. As they passed through the crowds, this was taking too long. And yet he did not want to annoy Jesus. So he held his tongue. He tried to be patient as he saw Jesus stop to touch one person after another, or sometimes just stop and speak to the person with words of comfort and encouragement. It was like they were in a procession. Not a single person was ignored. Every time he thought they would break from the crowd and be able to make their way at a faster pace, more people would crowd around the edges from the side streets. He felt time was running out for his daughter. There were eager hands reaching out to be healed. There were eager eyes looking for a look of comfort and compassion. There were eager hearts reaching out for forgiveness. There were eager souls reaching out to be blessed. He had passed these people daily on his walk to and from the temple, but he realized he'd never really seen them. But Jesus did. He saw each one. Jesus would stop and minister to first one and then another. His patience was almost at an end when Jesus stopped for no apparent reason and said, "Who touched me?" This was almost too much. Everyone was touching him. Jesus asked again and was looking around. He waited impatiently to hear the answer to this incredible question. Who touched me? Who hasn't touched you? But Jesus persisted. Finally, Peter voiced what Jairus was thinking. Lord, the crowd is pressed in on you from all sides. And you ask who touched you? Eventually, a woman came forward and bowed before him. She admitted that she had touched his garment, and she said that she'd been healed. She had been to doctors for over 12 years trying to get a cure. She had spent everything she had trying to be healed, chasing one thing after another. When she heard of Jesus, she felt that this was her last hope. She tried everything else. She could think of nothing else to try. But she was not strong enough to push through the crowds, and it looked like she wasn't going to be able to meet Jesus. But then he moved in her direction. He changed his course. He was coming towards her. But even then she had to fight with what little strength she had to maintain her position. Indeed, it took all her strength. And even then she realized that would just be out of his path. So she thought that if she could just reach far enough through all the legs and other garments to touch the hem of his garments, perhaps that would be enough. If he could heal her, then just the touch should be enough. And so she mustered all her strength and mustered all her faith. It would have to be enough. She'd almost lain down on the ground and eagerly reached as far as she could through the maze of legs and garments and just brushed the hem of his garment with her fingers. And she immediately felt that she was healed. Jairus marveled at this woman's story, and it seemed to shine hope into his heart that Jesus would indeed heal his daughter. This woman had been ill for 12 years. At the time when he was rejoicing over the birth of Sarah, this woman was just discovering her sickness. When Sarah's life was beginning, this woman's life was falling apart. She had spent her entire savings to attempt to be healed, and her last hope was Jesus. She had run out of resources. Her last hope was Jesus. She could think of nothing else. Her last hope was Jesus. And Jesus healed her. He had commended her for her faith. Jairus realized how similar her situation was to his own. Surely Jesus would heal his daughter too. He had to believe. How hard it was to overcome a lifetime of self-dependency. How hard it was to overcome his beliefs about the Messiah. How difficult to throw aside his conviction of what the Messiah was to do and who the Messiah was to be. Now they were once again headed toward Jairus' home. As Jairus eagerly pressed through the crowd, he saw his house servant coming towards him. And there was only one reason that servant would be coming towards him. It seemed that there was something within him that died, and tears came to his eyes. As the servant approached, he noticed tears in his eyes as well. The servant said, "Master, your little girl is dead. There's no reason to bother the teacher now." As Jairus turned to tell Jesus that he need not bother, Jesus looked at him. Jairus saw tears in the corners of Jesus' eyes as well. He placed a hand on Jairus' shoulder and said, "Don't be afraid, only believe." All he could do was nod his head. What was there to believe in? He feared living without his daughter. He feared what this would do to his wife. He feared what God was doing to him. Do not be afraid, only believe. He noticed that Jesus was now striding purposefully toward his house. But what was the point now? He should have done this sooner. "Don't be afraid," he'd said, "only believe." Jesus now seemed to be on a mission. If he had set out sooner like this, his daughter could have been healed. What was Jesus going to his house for now? He feared what he would find there. But he'd said, "Don't be afraid, Only believe. Jairus followed as quickly as he could. Somehow faith started to find its way through the fear, hope, and through the sorrow. As they approached the house, he could hear the mourners. They had arrived quickly, as was befitting a man of his stature in the community. Their wails of pretended sorrow seemed to strike a harsh note deep in his soul. It must have affected Jesus in the same way, for he rebuked them and told them that they need not mourn, for the little girl was just sleeping. At these words, the heart of Jairus lifted with new hope, but it was short-lived as the mourners started to laugh scornfully at Jesus' words and said, "We've seen her ourselves." Jairus' heart sank again. The fear and sorrow returned, but he said, "Do not be afraid, only believe." With authority, Jesus sent the mourners away. He then turned to Jairus' wife and bade her come with him to show the way to the girl. His wife just stared vacantly into space. All her tears had already been cried. She arose slowly and led the way. Jairus tried again to believe. He feared what he would see on that bed. But he had said, "Do not be afraid, only believe." Jesus followed her, and as if by some prearrangement, 3 of his followers came too. As they entered the bedroom, it was obvious to all that the girl was dead. But Jesus did not wait for hope to die out of Jairus' heart or for the fear to return. But he immediately went to the girl and took her hand and said, "Damsel, it is I who say to you, get up." And to the shock and relief of her parents, her eyes opened. She smiled and looked around for a moment, and then, still holding Jesus' hand, she got up. Jesus dropped her hand as both mother and father embraced their daughter. At first they were speechless with joy. Was this really their daughter, or was she a spirit? Jesus told them they should fix her something to eat. No spirit would need food. Must be their daughter. He also told them not to tell anybody about what had happened. And then before they knew it, Jesus was gone. Jairus continued to embrace his daughter and explain to her what had happened. How could they not tell everybody? He would tell anyone. He would tell everyone about this. The Messiah had come, and the news of this spread throughout all that region. I can't cook. Thought that might get your attention. You see, there seems to be this mystery, something about it that's unfathomable to me. Really good cooks have their own vocabulary. They use measurements that seem to be ambiguous. Now in science, especially chemistry, we make mixtures and solutions, adding various ingredients together. So I could follow recipes. But we measure everything precisely, because if you don't, you may end up with something very different. If you're careful, if you mix just the right amount of hydrochloric acid and sodium hydroxide together, you get salt water, which you could drink, and nothing would happen to you if you were confident in your measurements. I used to do that with my chemistry class. Ask them how much error there was in their measurements if they wanted to test it. Thankfully, none of them did. I probably would have got in trouble. But scientists measure to the hundredths of a gram and the tenth of a millimeter. Even junior high kids can do that. But cooking's not like this. Yeah, they have recipes, but then if it's not quite to their liking, they add a tad of this and a pinch of this and just a touch of something else. I don't know what those things mean. But I get a feeling that these are very small quantities. So when I saw the title of the chapter in Desire of Ages that contained this story, I saw a dual meaning. The first meaning being that the woman touched Jesus' garment in faith, and that would be the touch of faith. And if that had been the only story recorded in that chapter, I may have concluded that that was the only meaning, but include the story of Jairus, and I think maybe it also had a second meaning. That is, that both stories, they exhibited just a touch of faith. One of those small amounts. Just a little bit of faith. Both the woman and Jairus came to Jesus when all else failed. When everything they had tried didn't work. They came to him in desperation, grasping at straws, hoping beyond hope that he would do what people said he could do. Perhaps the woman exhibited a touch more faith. But the way the story is told in Desire of Ages, she could do nothing else but reach through the crowd to try and touch his garment. She had no other choice. I think they both exhibited just a touch of faith. But that small amount of faith, Jesus rewarded. They did all they could do, and as a last resort, they had just enough faith to come to Jesus. Just a touch of faith. It doesn't seem to require much faith to impress God. Maybe because his expectations for us might be too low. He knows what we're like. He told us that if we have faith the size of a mustard seed, we could say to this mountain, move over there, and it would move. I know I've confessed, and some of you have heard this, that as a child I tried to test this. For some reason this text really had me interested. Tried to drum up enough faith, just a mustard seed amount of faith, so that I could move mountains. Well, in Illinois, where I grew up, there weren't any mountains. But during our vacations, we would often travel west, and I remember looking at the rugged Grand Tetons and trying to muster enough faith to move those mountains. I thought it would be a good witnessing opportunity, because surely someone would notice that those mountains had moved, and they'd start asking questions. And they would come to me, and I'd tell them, if you have enough faith in God, move mountains. If you go there today, you'll still see them pretty much as they've always been. Although I've now come to find out that they are moving, but through natural causes, not my faith. I've come to realize that there are some larger mountains than those that we face in life, that faith does move. Faith the size of a mustard seed sounds like just a touch of faith to me. Just a touch of faith can move mountains. Just a touch of faith can heal the sick. Just a touch of faith can raise the dead to life. This humbles me to think how little faith I must have. Makes me want to say with the father of the demon-possessed boys, I believe, but help my unbelief. And Jesus asked the question, when the Son of Man returns, will he find faith on the earth? It doesn't say, will he find abundant faith or strong faith or mighty faith? Will he find faith, any faith at all? Will he find just a touch of faith? When we lived in Montana, we first lived in a fairly large house that had a fireplace insert. And in those Montana winters, that stove could easily devour 12 to 15 cords of wood a year in the winter. So I bought an old half-ton truck, a chainsaw, and a wood-cutting permit. And many summer days would find us up in the mountains cutting firewood. On this particular trip, the whole family came along. My wife and 2 kids. Kids were too young to help, but they enjoyed being up in the mountains. This is a true lesson in perspective. To me, it was a lot of work. To them, it was an adventure. And on this trip, it got to be a lesson in faith as well. We had loaded the truck completely full and prepared to leave. However, there was one critical obstacle to that plan. Once we got in, the truck wouldn't start. We were a good 20 miles off in the mountains on a weekday. We hadn't seen or heard anyone else all day long as we were cutting wood, as I was cutting wood. Now, I'm not much of a mechanic, and I don't even know why I do this, although I've done it a number of times. But when the truck would not start, I got out and lifted the hood and looked at the engine. I could at least assure myself that it was still there. But there was, to me, a maze of wires and pulleys and odd-shaped contraptions fastened together. Like I said, I don't know why I do this. I guess it's just what men do when the vehicle won't start. My wife and children were counting on me to fix it. I suppose this behavior was supposed to instill confidence in them that I could do something to remedy the situation. This is better than having them panic and start screaming at me. Terribly helpless feeling, so I just wiggled some wires, checked the battery cables, gave the entire compartment a close visual scrutiny. I've done this numerous times down through my life with very little success. It had never worked before, and I knew it wasn't going to work this time. I was really stalling for time while I thought of what I was going to tell Kathy and the kids. So finally I closed the lid and dusted off my hands and confidently announced that we were going to have to coast-start the truck. Now, I had done this with other vehicles and had gotten some good results at times. And thankfully, we were up in the mountains and had a road that led downhill for a long ways. With that load of wood, it should pick up speed pretty fast. I thought this would be a good time to teach our kids a bit more about prayer. Mainly because I had a fair degree of confidence that I could get the truck started this way. And thus that would increase their faith. Don't judge. I know you've done some of the same things with your kids. So we prayed, asking God to start our truck. We all got in, got belted in. I took off the parking brake, turned the key on, depressed the clutch, and let it roll, and rolled it did. Picked up speed very fast. When it got to speed, I felt it should. I let the clutch, and it came so very close to starting. So very close. So I tried again, and it just almost started. It was so tantalizingly close. I found that the third time's not always a charm. Neither is the fourth, fifth, or sixth. And finally, we ended up in a little dip in the road, and the truck was not going to roll anymore of its own accord, nor could I push it out of that dip with or without the wood. For you younger members, this was a time before cell phones. Yes, many, many years ago. I know that's hard to imagine. Things were indeed primitive back then. We were stuck. What do you do when you don't have a cell phone? Well, I felt it was time for me to make another inspection of the engine compartment. So I got out and lifted the hood once again, not knowing exactly what I should do. I shook some wires, inspected everything. I guess hoping from some big red arrow with a sign saying, "Here's your problem," like they show in the books. But nothing like that. So I closed the hood, got back in the truck, feeling bad that we were stranded, and that I was going to have to talk to my kids about how God does not always answer prayers with a yes. Tyler, who was 7 years old, must have noticed the look on my face. He said, "Well, I guess it's going to be harder for God to start the truck now." He was essentially saying that now that I had run out of ways to help God, it was going to be harder for God to help me. I think this is often the case. But there's something backwards about that. We have to exercise just a touch of faith sometimes. Is the God that healed the sick and raised the dead going to have a hard time bringing this truck back to life? The God that spoke the seas into existence, filled them with every imaginable form of living things. Is he going to be puzzled about starting a truck? The God who set the solar systems in place and yet sees a sparrow fall is going to sweat over something so insignificant as starting this truck? Now, granted, it was a Chevy, but still. So I thought, well, let's give this baby one more try before I start thinking about hiking out. So I turned the key in the ignition, the truck roared to life, and we drove home. I had a lot to think about as I drove out of the mountains that day. I was humbled, to say the least. How often we let God down because we fail to exercise just a touch of faith. Morris Venden, in his book From Exodus to Advent, page 155, makes the following observation. And I quote, "When the devil fails to get people to work on their works, to try to get to heaven by their own achievements, then he seeks to lead them to work on their faith. But faith is not something you work on. Faith is spontaneous and comes from knowing God. So when the devil fails to get us to give up on working our way to heaven by our works, then he tries to get us to work our way to heaven by working on our faith. So how do we get to know God, if that's the key? We are counseled to not forget how God has led and blessed us in the past as a means of increasing our faith. What stories do we have? What experiences that we should remember how God has revealed himself to us? There are also many stories in the Bible that should increase our faith because they increase our knowledge of God. The stories that many of us grew up with, if we grew up in a Christian home and or went to a Christian school. The titles of these stories roll like a tapestry of faith. David and Goliath, Daniel in the lion's den, Noah in the flood, the fiery furnace, Jonah in the whale, Elijah on Mount Carmel, the thief on the cross, the resurrection. Sometimes it's just names that remind us of the stories. Ruth, and Esther, Samson, Moses, Gideon, Deborah, Samuel, and yes, even the donkey. Each of these stories, like the ones I shared today, tell us more about God's character, and we get to know God better. You could probably think of others. You could go around the room and you could all give me one that you thought was very good, showed you something about the character of God. Going along with our lesson today, the Jewish parents, as they fled to Egypt, were told to continually remind their children about the things that God did to bring them out of the land of their bondage. They were supposed to keep this to the forefront of their children's minds. Let them know what God was like. Before Moses died, he told the people to remember how God had led them with a mighty hand out of Egypt and through the Red Sea. Joshua's parting message to the Israelites was to remember how God had led them out of Egypt to the borders of the Promised Land and established them in the land of milk and honey. So hasn't he done something for each of us? These are things that we need to remember. These are things for which we need to continue to be thankful. This helps us increase our faith because it helps us or continues to teach us more and more about our God that we serve, a God that we can come to trust. Now, some of you might be mighty in faith, and I applaud you. But when we look at the ingredients that make up our lives, the challenges, the decisions, the distractions, along with me, couldn't you use just a touch more faith? You stand for the benediction. Jesus, how we trust you. How we've proved you over and over. Jesus, precious Jesus. Oh, for grace to trust you more. Please help us to have just a touch more faith.